Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending when you're watching this. Today we're going to be looking at quantitative and qualitative research. So, I'm super excited to be able to take you through the understanding of ways that we approach research from both quantitative or numeric or qualitative, which is more in-depth interviews and other structures of this. But this lecture will focus on understanding the difference between quantitative and that qualitative research. So let's get to it. So when we're looking at quant or qual, right, the goal of these is to be able to have a different approach to different strokes. It's not always going to be that we find that one method approaches all of them. So first, we're going to focus on the quan or quantitative research methods. Quantitative research involves the process of objectivity or objectively collecting and analyzing numerical data. The goal of quantitative research is to test relationships between variables and to generalize the results of a wider population, right? When we're looking at something, it's not feasible that we could be able to have everybody do the sample, right? So we want it to be generalizable so that we can base it upon the significance, right? So quantitative methods are typically used for descriptive or correlational and experimental research. Descriptive research seeks to give an overall summary of the study variables, right? While correlation research examines the relationship between the study variables. Experimental research examines whether there is a cause and effect relationship between variables. When conducting quantitative research, researchers often have to operationally define the variables in their study. Operational definition translates abstract concepts into the observable and measurable variables. I always told my intro class, if I asked you if you're a good driver, versus how many speeding tickets have you had in the last 6 months. That could change based upon subjectivity. So when we are conducting these types of research, this kind of operational definition is so important because how we ask the question can almost mean more than the question. When we're looking at experimental research, it examines whether there is a cause and effect relationship between variables, right? So we also want to make sure that we're avoiding correlation and causation issues. So for example, if a researcher wanted to measure participants' level of happiness, they must define what they mean by happiness and create a scale which happiness can be measured in a numerical way, right? Same thing when I just mentioned, are you a good driver versus how many tickets in the last 6 months versus 12 months versus 24 months. So that's where you see that kind of descriptive, correlational, and experimental. A fun one for you if you're not familiar, right? Correlation causation issues, why we want to make sure correlation matters. When there is a new Nicolas Cage movie, historically, there has been an increase in drowning. Those are not actually correlated. They just happen to be happenstance. The famous one you might have heard, right, is in the summer ice cream sales go up, but in the summer murder rates go up. Unless you take into the correlation between the two different things as you're looking at them, you would think that those things have this kind of causal effect. It doesn't. There's a reason that they happen, right? People are outside more and the heat makes us more agitated, so violence increases in the summer. Summer temperatures encourage us to have more ice cream. You would be able to know that, but if you just looked at the data numerically, you might think there was some nefarious story. So as we're looking at this, let's talk a little bit more about some other areas, right? Experiment, survey, systemic or systematic observation, and secondary research. All right. So there are different types of methods that can be used to conduct these quantitative research, right? One type is to conduct an experiment. In an experiment, the researcher manipulates the independent variable, which we talked about last lecture, and measures the effect on the dependent variable. Researchers then measure the dependent variable numerically using quantitative research. For example, students in a class may be separated into groups, two groups, all right? One group may receive extra tutoring and study support while the other group receives normal level of in-class support. At the end of the class, the two groups may be compared on their grade to see if the extra support of the groups had higher grades. This quantitative because grades are measured in a numerical fashion, usually on a scale of 0 to 100%. I can give you an example of this. I teach in person here at Arizona State. I have large classrooms of 400 plus in each one. And I've had the university actually reach out to me and brought someone in who wasn't a TA, but was a support to be able to have access to my Canvas so that they could send out announcements, and they were in-class support. And this was a student that enrolled in a job within the university to see if this would help engagement and overall grades increase over intro. Upon the end of the class, they evaluated with this student in there as an additional support, were there more A's? And what was the percentage compared to last semester, right? So this is used all the time. Another quantitative research method is to use a survey. This is what I did for a lot of my life. This method This is a method that allows a large number of people to answer questions, either in person, over the phone, or online, much more online these days. Surveys typically have rating scales that are later assigned a numerical value. These vary by how you're trying to do your research, right? For example, if you responded to a survey and answer options that range from completely disagree to completely agree, the scale may range from 0 to 4, with 0 equally completely disagree, 1 equaling somewhat disagree, 2 being neither agree nor disagree, and 3 being somewhat agree, and 4 being completely agree, right? So you start seeing staggered levels of how I respond. These numerical values can be used to analyze the data and test relationships between the variables. So quantitative research can also use observations as long as they are completed in a systemic way where numerical values are assigned to the behaviors being observed. For example, children may be observed and a researcher may code their emotions on a scale of 1 to 5. The researchers will have strict guidelines for what types of behaviors represent 1 all the way to 5. For instance, 1, happiness may be coded if the child displays no signs of happiness, but a 5 may be chosen if the child smiles 3 or more times and laughs at least once during this observation period. As long as the observation is systemic or systematic and codes behaviors numerically, then is considered quantitative research. Another quantitative method, though, is to conduct it using secondary research, things that already exist. Secondary research is when data is used that had been collected for other purposes. For example, some organizations publish their data online, so any researcher can use them. If the data being used as secondary research is numerical, then that research is considered on a quantitative basis. An interesting analysis for this, I did a study looking at a religious affiliation behind members of the LGBTQ and the perceived stigma around church as church numbers were dwindling. This research that I conducted had a 40-something thousand sample and had really cool results. However, the reason I was able to conduct it is that I was in connection with a not-for-profit organization that was measuring religious attendance, and they were seeing that it dwindled a little bit. Truth be told, it was dwindling, and it has been dwindling, but the research questions they were asking was not really focused on the LGBTQ. That had just been a subsection of the questionnaires that they wanted to write. And because of this, I was able to use secondary research in a primary format because it wasn't something they were scaling and they hadn't submitted. However, the study that I got to conduct had a large, robust sample because it was just a portion of a study that had been finished, and I was able to work with them to pull the secondary research for something that I thought needed importance. So you never know where you can find this at. Another thing that quantitative research typically is analyzes using statistics, right? Both descriptive statistics and inferential statistics can be done with quantitative data. Descriptive statistics provides a summary of data, like the mean, the median, and the mode, right? You might have heard what the mean house price is, right? And this is where you start seeing this kind of way to start using these types of differentiations, whether it's descriptive or inferential, right? And this is where you start seeing kind of the ability to understand that we're looking, what is the mode, what is the median range, what's that kind of mean structure. So descriptive statistics can also be used to visualize data in graphs, if you're a graph person, scatter plots, and frequency tables. Inferential statistics allow you to do your hypothesis, often by looking at the relationship between variables. This can be done using statistical techniques like correlations, t-tests, ANOVA, regressions, you name it, terms you likely have heard. Or maybe you haven't, and we'll get to those in this class. But statistical analysis are typically used for quantitative research, since qualitative data is typically numerical in nature. Quantitative data is typically numerical in nature. So, right, we're still looking at numbers. Some strength of quantitative research includes its ability to be replicated, right? So it's important that you can do something and that's not a one-off situation. Replication is possible because data is typically collected in a standardized way and uses that scientific method and analyzed using statistical techniques. So it's something that becomes really important is that you have these areas that can be utilized, that it's not just something you did. So replication is important as mentioned for those reasons, and quantitative research is also useful because its results can be compared. If a researcher replicates the experiment or tests the experiment with a new population, the results can be compared statistically. So some researchers conduct meta-analyses in which they pull statistical data from many different research studies and compare them. And this is possible because they are numerical in nature. You utilize common statistical analysis techniques. And another strength that we can, as we're talking about strengths, is that quantitative studies tend to have larger samples, since the data is easier to collect and analyze, and since it's in numerical form. And lastly, when we're talking about this, hypothesis testing is another strength of quantitative research. Since statistical analysis are being used that will tell you if your researches are significant or not, researchers are able to test if the data supports their hypothesis, not just speculate, allowing it to be more scientific. So when we're looking at this, you have to realize not everything is going to be possible, right? So there are limitations, and quantitative research also has some of these. One limitation is that quant research can be superficial, and this is true. Since complex variables have to operationally define for quantitative research, it's possible that researchers are missing some of the nuances of data that could be more thoroughly described through maybe qualitative research. Quantitative research also tends to have more narrow focus since this type of research measures specific variables that are decided by the researchers, right? There's one of the issues there. If it is possible to the other relevant variables related to the research questions are not measured or being measured. Thus, if I wanted to ask what type of driver you are, what if that was just my question and you answered it on a Likert scale, right? 1 to 10, 1 to 4, 1 to 7, and I didn't specify time delegations. Therefore, I wasn't looking or asking the question properly enough to be able to not have these issues that we just discussed. So quantitative methods can also have a structural bias. This may occur from things like missing data, imprecise measurement tools, and inappropriate sampling methods. As I mentioned last lecture, we had significant findings when we tested the vaccinations with COVID-19, a recent thing that we experienced. However, if we look at the issues or the inappropriate sampling methods, they did not include a proportion of the population that needed to be done in a large capacity. Thus, we found issues that, when it passed a quantitative analysis and an evaluation, it was great. However, it was not having the right sampling methods, thus created issues that was not forecasted. So lastly, quantitative methods can also lack context, right? Quantitative data is not typically gathered in a natural setting and doesn't always take in the larger social context that could affect the data collection. So different from this, though, is we have other methods. We have ability to kind of look at this from a different perspective. And this is where you would go into what is known as qualitative research. And that is something that I'm very familiar with and a huge fan of. But quantitative methods are different, right, from qualitative, whereas qualitative research focuses on understanding how people experience the world. So more of a Verstehen. This type of research also tends to provide deeper insights into a phenomenon and also helps generate new ideas for research. Excuse me. There are some common approaches that are used to conduct qualitative research. One approach is to use grounded theory. Using this approach, researchers collect in-depth data on a topic that data develops theories about that specific topic. There's a lot of if or buts about the idea of can someone truly be grounded when we're looking at this type of approach, but it is a method that is used. Another approach is ethnography. In ethnography, researchers immerse themselves in a group or people in an organization to try and better understand the culture. Action research is another approach to this kind of qualitative research. In this approach, researchers and participants work together to link theories about a topic in the real world settings and in an attempt to create social change. Adding another approach is phenomenological research. With this approach, researchers investigate a phenomenon by collecting and interpreting the lived experience of their participants. And lastly, narrative research involves researchers examining how stories are told to understand how participants make sense of their experiences. In all of these approaches, the data collection or collected is non-numerical and often has detailed descriptions of participants' experiences with the top being studied. Now, I want to add some context before we get to the next slide. All of these approaches, just like Quan, have their problems, and we'll discuss that. But there's also something to be said about how much the lived experience matters. Prior to my time here in academia, I was doing research for a large think tank. It was a political think tank, and people are pretty devout on their political ideation, right, and their beliefs, as we've seen in past years. But what was interesting is this think tank was seeing a progressively reduced amount of donations. However, the Likert satisfaction scale was showing the same kind of results consistently year after year, between 4 and 5, which is really ideal, but their donations went down. when I joined the company, I've always seen the value in the open-end questions and responding. They'd always asked a few open-end questions at the end of all the surveys I had done for them. And I asked my company at the time, when I was still an account executive before being a director, had we gone through the Qual to see what was missing? And they're like, there's thousands of responses through the years. If you want to, feel free to do so. And I did. And long story short, once I found the correlation, it was as simple as not feeling seen, heard, or understood. They didn't have events, they weren't really engaging with them. And once they fixed that and made more engagement to the community per their request, donations went up because it wasn't about the satisfaction of the political structure. It was about not feeling seen, and qualitative research allowed them to have that. So it's important how we approach these research steps, right? So when we get from there, each of these research approaches that we were talking about before involves using one or more types of qualitative data collection methods. One of the most common types of qualitative methods is to use observations. Researchers can record what they have seen, heard, or encountered in detailed field notes. For example, in the research using ethnography as their approach, they may be living within a specific cultural group and taking detailed field notes on their observations about what types of activities these groups engage in and how they interact with their families, and other observations about life in particular culture groups. Another common qualitative research method is to conduct interviews and ask people questions in a one-to-one setting. This allows really in-depth information to be collected on specific topics. This type of data collection method may be used by researchers who use grounded theory approach because they want to collect in-depth information on a topic. Another approach is to conduct focus groups. Focus groups involve gathering a group of people and asking them questions to generate discussion amongst the group of people. Many companies conduct these focus groups with customers to understand what customers like and didn't like about the products and also give them breakthrough ideas. I did this a lot in the market research world. Focus groups may also be used by researchers using an action research approach, as participants can have one group have discussions to brainstorm ways to implement new practices that result in social change. Surveys that contain open-ended questions can also be used for qualitative research. Open-ended questions allow participants to provide more in-depth answers than only responding to a scale. As I was mentioning with my company that I was at, there were questions being asked, but are they being used is always a big thing. However, surveys are often still limited compared to interviews when it comes to collecting in-depth qualitative research because follow-up questions based on participants' responses can be asked in the interview, but not on a survey. So we see some limitations. And lastly, secondary research can be used to collect qualitative research. This type of secondary research would involve gathering existing data form of text, images, audio, video, or recordings. Secondary research may be useful to those using a narrative research approach because they can use the stories told through the text, the images, or videos to understanding how people make sense of their experiences. So, getting some ideas around the conversations here. Another important thing for us to discuss, right, is since qualitative data is textual instead of numerical, the approach to analyzing data is different from the quantitative data. There are 5 main steps that most types of qualitative data analysis share. First, researchers prepare and organize their data. They may involve transcribing interviews by typing up field notes. This has changed a lot with AI. You now have new tools that can help make transcripts and make them a lot faster than it used to be. It used to be 3 times the one or around there time to do something. But second, researchers review and explore that data. This involves examining the data for patterns, using things like Taget to see what themes are, right? Or looking to see if repeated ideas emerge. Is there something that's there that you didn't see before? There's a pattern on why people are doing this. Third, researchers need to develop a coding system. How are we categorizing these labels? And by developing a coding system, it allows researchers to categorize their data and allow for more patterns to be recognized. Fourth, researchers can actually assign codes to this said data. This involves going through all the data and assigning codes based on categories or systems the researchers creates in the step 3. Lastly, researchers identify that recurring patterns or themes. In this step, researchers look at the codes and links together in an overarching themes. What is standing out? Although analyzing qualitative data often shares these 5 steps, there are different approaches that can be used to analyze that qualitative data. The first approach is known as the content analysis. Now, content analysis involves describing categorizing the common words, phrases, and ideas. Thematic analysis involves identifying and interpreting patterns and themes in the data, and textual analysis involves examining the content structure and design of texts. And lastly, discourse analysis involves studying how communication and language is used to achieve effects in specific contexts. In each of these approaches, data is examined and categorized, but the way in which they are categorized varies based on the approach that is being used. So we see even the complexity of Qual versus Quan, you're not really getting away from the complexity by going to verbal. You're still going to have more and more ways. It's just a new and different form to be able to obtain that rich research-based information and observations from people within the communities or areas. So let's look at some strengths of the qualitative research. Qualitative research has some strengths that are unique and separate from quantitative. Qualitative research has flexibility as the data collection and analysis process can be adapted as new ideas emerge. For example, when conducting interviews, researchers can ask follow-up questions to a participant if their response is interesting and the researcher wants to dive deeper into that topic with the participant. Another strength is that qualitative research is more likely to occur in the natural setting, so you're not putting someone outside of their natural environment, which allows them to feel comfort. For example, if ethnographic research, a researcher is often living among a community and is embedded in their culture, and in order to learn about and more to learn about it, right? This natural setting allows them to learn more about the community and then asking questions to the community members in a different setting. So the qualitative data also allows researchers to meaningfully insights, as this type of research allows them to gain the detailed descriptions of people's experience, feelings, and perceptions. And lastly, qualitative research is great for the generation of new ideas. The open-ended responses that are a part of many types of qualitative research allows researchers to uncover new problems and opportunities that they may not have thought of otherwise. Tie back to my example from being in the market research world. By finding out that it was simplistically based around a lack of feeling seen, they were able to, with reason, throw a relatively inexpensive party, meet together, meet the persons, right, and an event. And that then allowed their numbers to scale back up for the funding of that research, of that political think tank. And it was something that they hadn't thought of. They probably overthought it. They probably thought that would never be as simple as just showing face. And it was. And that's where you start seeing even the obvious that we overlook can be seen within different methods of approaching it. So, what are some of the limitations, though, of qualitative research, as we've talked about all these things? In addition to its strength, qualitative research also has some major limitations. Qualitative data is subjective, right? We're hearing the stories of people within the community, and there are the experts in that moment, but how are we interpreting? What are we seeing, and do our biases overstand it? Since researchers create codes and analyze the data, to decide on what themes are important, it makes the interpretation of the data more subjective than quantitative research. For this reason, it's really difficult to replicate qualitative research, and you can see why. Qualitative data also has limited generalizability. This is because small samples are typically used to gain in-depth knowledge on certain groups of people. Due to this, data may not be representative of a wider population outside of the population in question being studied. Qualitative research is also conducted in uncontrolled settings, so it is possible that the outside factors could impact the reliability of data being collected. Lastly, qualitative data collection is very time consuming and can be expensive, as a lot more people are needed to conduct in-depth interviews with participants and code the large amounts of textual data are often results from this type of qualitative research. I want to add something to that as we are advancing in times of technology. It used to be that it was much more time consuming and participant involving in the sense of research assistance and AI, without AI. AI, Taget, transcriptions, TurboScribe, all these different new tools have opened the door to being able to have much faster transcriptions of these interviews. And things like Zoom, digital interfaces that you can meet with people, it's also expanded the sampling distribution for these types of research because you can be able to conduct an interview in 4 different states. Now, that doesn't take away the time and the emotional resources it takes to conduct an interview, but it does start some new conversations on what else can we do. So when it comes to quantitative be qualitative, there's a reality that needs to be mentioned, right? And that is simply put that when we're thinking about how we want to do our research, whether we want to do a quantitative or qualitative research, it's important to remember that neither method is better than the other. The type of method used really depends on the goal of the researcher. If a researcher wants to collect data on a large number of people and analyze the data using statistics, then quantitative research would be a better choice for them. However, if researchers want to collect in-depth information on a small group of people to better understand the nuances of the topic, then the qualitative research may be a better choice. In fact, both approaches are valuable, that some researchers use what's called a mixed method approach. Mixed method research uses a mix of quant and qual methods. For example, researchers may start with interviews of a smaller group of people to learn more about that topic that impacts their community. Then researchers may analyze this data and come up with common themes, and then use those themes to create a standardized survey that could send out to a larger group of people and analyze statistically. So it really matters about how you want to do it. My own research is conducted with mixed methodological approaches, and the reason is I'm interviewing people who've survived congregate care in their families. There is a story that needs to be told, but there's also a need for descriptive statistics and inferential statistics and quantitative statistics. So the usage of both provides a more large story to be captured. So one would not be without the other. It's important that you find what is the best method, but it's not a matter of what's better than what, right? It's almost the conversation when you say V up there, right? Uh, it's not always V, it's more about what is best going to fit you. So this brings us to kind of a conclusion of this conversation around qual and quan methods. I hope that you have enjoyed or have learned something from it, and I will see you at the next lecture. Thank you.